Hi, my name is Mike van Schieten, and I'm a data creation scientist in the EBRAINS creation team. In this video, I will talk about the importance and best practices of data organization. This video is part of a collection of videos developed by the EBRAINS Data and Knowledge team, in which we explain the steps of data creation in EBRAINS. In this course, we particularly focus on data and metadata organization and writing a data descriptor. The organization of data refers to the arrangement of files and figures according to their common characteristics or how they're separated into different parts to facilitate the comparison with other data files. This way, you can highlight these important characteristics of the data and consolidate the volume of data to make further analysis possible. Data can be organized using different methods, such as a graphical presentation, as you can see on this slide. But without any of the links between the data files, it's very difficult to understand how these files are interrelated. And even when we add the links between the files to illustrate their relationship, this diagram is still not self-explanatory. It's therefore important to structure your data in such a way that the relationships between the files are understandable to everyone. In this video, I will give you some tips and tricks on how to transform unstructured data into structured data so that it will look a bit more like this. Before we dive into the fundamentals of good data organization, let's look at the benefits first. Well-organized and structured data are easier to interpret and to use. It also reduces misunderstandings of data specifications for others, as well as for your future self. And it facilitates quick processing of data, so it's important to start the organization early on in the data collection process. Good data organization relies on the appropriate use of naming conventions, providing extensive metadata, and grouping the data based on common characteristics. Also, it's important to choose the right folder hierarchy and think about the interoperability of your data files and formats. So let's look at these 5 steps in a bit more detail. The naming of files is instrumental to the organization of your data. So when you're choosing your name, it's important to avoid any ambiguity. Use standardized and generic terms at the beginning of the name and put the unique and sequential IDs at the end. You can increase the interoperability of your data files by using the English language and replacing any spaces by underscores or hyphens. File names with spaces are usually difficult to read by machines, which again then complicates the use of automated processing pipelines. So we propose to use the following naming convention. Start with a general description of the data, for example, whether the data is raw or processed, or which technique or task was used to generate the data. Then include information about the origin of the data, for example, the subject ID or the preparation that was used. Put any additional information such as a cell number, a drug, or a date at the end of the name. Although the name of a file should be descriptive enough to understand the content of the file, it's always important to provide metadata to your data. We consider 2 types of metadata documentation: machine-readable and human-readable metadata. Machine-readable metadata should be stored in key value pairs. In this particular example, the key is the age of the animal, and the value is 8 weeks. Human-readable metadata typically describes the process of how data is collected and analyzed. But it also describes how the data is structured, as you can see in this particular example. In the next few slides, I will give a couple more examples of how a data record section might look like. When organizing your data, it is crucial to consider the characteristics of a data set and think about what is important to emphasize. The data could be grouped based on these common characteristics. For example, data might be grouped based on the research modality. So you can think about functional data, anatomical data, or whether it's raw or processed data. But another option is to group your data based on the relationship. So such as the subject or the methods that were used. Let's consider two different research objectives to illustrate the grouping of the data. For example, your research was aimed to identify the functional properties of cortical pyramidal neurons in the mouse and the rat. The data for the study shares certain characteristics, such as the location, the cortex, the cell type, pyramidal neurons, and the research modality, its functional data. The only characteristic that is not shared is the species that it's derived from, which is the rat versus the mouse. Therefore, a logical grouping for this particular example could be based on the two species. For another research objective, we may use a different type of grouping. For a research project that was aimed to identify the spontaneous activity of cortical neurons, we could group the data based on the identity of the cortical neurons, since the location and the species are shared properties, but the cell type is not. Once you've grouped your data into folders, it is important to structure them in a hierarchical manner to illustrate how folders are interlinked. We call this the folder hierarchy of a dataset. As a general rule, always place the metadata a level higher than the folder it describes, and also avoid folders with only one single file in it. We propose the following folder hierarchy. Start again with a general description of your research project and use this as your root directory. This is where the data descriptor of your project and your license files are typically stored. The next level groups data based on the data type, and this could be raw or processed data or even programming scripts. The next level gives more in-depth information about the files, such as the technique, the task, or the subject ID. So let's use the same research examples to illustrate the folder hierarchy of a dataset. In research objective 1, we want to emphasize that the data is derived from two different species, but all the other characteristics are the same. So this means that we have to have separate folders for mouse and rat data. I've now used an example where I group the files under raw data, but you can obviously extend this or change this by processed data or derived data as well. When we look at the second example, we see that the folder hierarchy also reflects the change in emphasis of your data. Since the data is derived from only one species, but from different cell types, we now group the data based on the cell type. The interoperability of data is particularly important for reuse purposes. For example, imagine that you need 5 different types of software to access the data, and that some of the software is not even openly available. In such a case, the use and interoperability of your data is limited. We therefore always recommend to reduce the number of file formats and use non-commercial file formats. For example, most MATLAB data files could be easily converted into a CSV file, which could then be opened by open software. It's also beneficial if you make your processing and analysis scripts openly available. So I listed a couple of open file formats on the left side, and this could be plain text, CSV or TSV files, PDF files, or tar or zip files for archiving, JSON files, which typically use the key value notation, MKV and PNG for other media files. Proper organization and structuring of data has gained traction in the neuroscience community and led to development of the BITS format, which stands for Brain Imaging Data Structure. This is a great example of how data, and particularly neuroimaging data, can be organized. But it's important to note that data organization is crucial for any type of data, not just neuroimaging data. But most importantly, EBRAINS do accept the BITS data organization format and also encourage you to use it. Well, I hope that these tips will help you to organize your data so that you can emphasize the important characteristics of your data set and also facilitate the use and reuse of your data in the future. This video was made possible by the EBRAINS Data and Knowledge team of 2021 and the partnering institutes for storage and computing. Please also check out the other videos on the INCF training space and send us an email if you have any questions or follow us on social media. Thank you.